They stole a nuclear submarine, and the world never noticed. You think the ocean keeps its secrets. You think a Soviet sub lost in 1968 stayed on the seafloor forever. But wait, here's the twist. The CIA built a fake mining ship under Howard Hughes' name and tried to steal that submarine from 16,500 feet down. And the consequence? What came up wasn't just metal. It birthed the most powerful sentence in modern secrecy. We can neither confirm nor deny, and rewired how nations fight in silence. Engineering pushed past physics. The cover story became policy, and the ocean stopped being a graveyard. It became a battlefield. Did America steal a nuclear submarine from 16,500 feet, or did the ocean win and Washington rewrite the rules to hide it? That's our line in the water. On one side, missiles, codes, metallurgy, and a covert lift that pushed engineering to the edge. On the other, a billion-dollar lie with a perfect face, a ship that wasn't what it claimed, and a phrase that still shields power with a shrug. Here's what's at stake. In 1968, the Soviet K-129 vanished northeast of Hawaii with nuclear weapons and cryptographic gear aboard. If the United States could find it and reach it, it might pull open the heart of Soviet deterrence. How their missiles were built, how their codes were carried, how their crews lived and died. But the cost wasn't just money or risk at sea. It was diplomatic blowback if exposed, a crisis if Moscow caught them in the act, and a precedent if they didn't. That silence could be weaponized in public. You're not getting a tour of hardware. You're walking into rooms where decisions were made. We'll show how the US wired the ocean to hear an implosion signature and drew a box on a map when everyone else was still guessing. We'll sit with engineers who sketched a claw the size of a building, then learn the ocean punishes optimism. We'll watch a cover story grow legs. Howard Hughes, mining, manganese nodules, while a custom ship hid a moon pool and a capture vehicle named for good luck. And we'll follow the moment the secret broke, first as rumor, then in print, then on national radio, forcing the government to answer without answering at all. Roadmap. First, the vanishing. K-129 goes silent, the Soviet Navy scours empty water, and American hydrophones whisper a location. Second, the ears. SOSUS, low-frequency anomalies, and triangulation that turned a noise into a bearing. Third, the lift. Physics, fatigue, and Clementine, the grabber that almost held. Fourth, the lie. Front companies, shell contracts, and a ship too strange to explain any other way. Fifth, the grab and the snap. Inches won, tons lost, and what came up anyway remains wreckage and questions. Sixth, the leak. Reporters circling, lawyers drafting, and the birth of neither confirm nor deny. Finally, fallout. Soviet doctrine hardens, American policy learns to speak in silence, and deep ocean operations become the new high ground. What we promise, verifiable facts, human stakes, and the engineering seen through people, not blueprints. No invented quotes. When the record is thin, we'll say so. Stay close. The abyss kept secrets. So did the people who reached into it. Vanishing Act, when K-129 disappeared. The patrol was supposed to be routine. Early March 1968, Gulf II, Class K-129 cleared Petropavlovsk and slid east into the Pacific, 3 nuclear-tipped SSN-4s aboard, crew 80+, radios disciplined. A midnight check-in near the 180th meridian came and went. Then another. Then silence. No SOS, no debris, just a hole where a submarine should be. Inside Soviet homes on Kamchatka, wives waited by phones that didn't ring. In Vladivostok, staff officers stared at message boards that refused to change. The Northern and Pacific fleets spun up a search no one wanted to admit was desperate. Aircraft running racetracks over grey water, destroyers combing grid after grid, a flotilla of trawlers pressed into service. They dragged lines. They listened. The ocean answered with wind. From Moscow's perspective, losing a ballistic missile boat wasn't just human tragedy. It was doctrine cracking. If K-129 had suffered a catastrophic failure, why no trace? If it had collided with whom? One rumor blamed an American sub. Another whispered sabotage. Officially, the order was find it. Unofficially, the directive was don't panic. Meanwhile, in rooms the Soviets couldn't see, another map was taking shape. In places like Midway and Wahoo and outposts whose names didn't appear in newspapers, the United States had laid a quiet net, SOSUS hydrophones wiring the deep sound channel. Most days, those ears turned ocean roar into orderly lines. Merchant screws, whales, the honest mess of a living sea. But in early March 1968, analysts circled a spike. Low frequency, sharp, a signature that didn't match weather or shipping. To understand why, we need to sit with a watchstander for a minute. Night shift, coffee gone cold, papergram creeping like a seismograph. He'd been trained to ignore drama. The job was to trust the math. Yet when a narrow band jumped and then died, he wrote the time down twice. A second station, thousands of miles away, logged a similar pulse with a different delay. Triangulation isn't magic, it's subtraction and patience. Bearings intersect. Confidence climbs. A box appears on water that looks empty to everyone else. Officially, the US didn't know the sub's name. Unofficially, the context, the missing check-ins, Soviet search patterns, filled the label in. The box sat roughly 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii, depth near 16,500 feet. That number mattered. It turned tragedy into opportunity and opportunity into a problem almost no one believed was solvable. While the Soviet armada swept where pride demanded, American collection tightened where physics pointed. The nuclear submarine USS Halibut, re-rigged as a deep ocean reconnaissance platform, began the slow work of going where ships couldn't be seen and cameras could. She towed arrays and cameras along the seafloor, a slow-motion lawnmower cutting swathes of imagery, frame by frame. Somewhere in that grey murk they expected twisted metal and a crater. What they found, months later, was worse and better. A submarine broken, yes, but in pieces large enough to tempt planning. Back ashore, the human side didn't pause. On Kamchatka, an officer knocked on an apartment door with a list in his hand and practiced condolences in a voice that wouldn't crack. In Washington, a small circle began speaking in code words. Azorian would come later. For now it was need to know and a whiteboard full of headaches. Could the US reach the wreck without starting a war? Could it lift without breaking? Could it keep quiet long enough to try? Meanwhile, Moscow ran its own calculus. They moved from broad sweeps to focused watching. An intelligence trawler, the Gidrograph, shadowed legitimate nodule surveys, not realizing those zigzags were cover rehearsals. In cables back to the Kremlin, skepticism softened into wary respect. If Americans were planning something impossible, the only rational defense was to treat it as theater. Let them posture about mining. If they truly tried a lift, surely the ocean would swat them. There's a micro-story the families remember. A mother on a stairwell, letter in one hand, a tin cup in the other, telling a neighbor that her husband was on exercise and would be late. She didn't believe it. She said the same sentence for months because no one told her what we now know. The boat lay on the bottom, twisted at angles crews trained to avoid in simulators. In a drawer in Honolulu, a US analyst tucked a strip of acoustic paper into a file marked March 8. The world kept moving. What nobody on either shore grasped yet was how the disappearance would ripple. For the Soviets, it would harden bastion strategy and tighten procedures around code gear. For the US, it would fuse oceanography with ambition and turn manganese nodules into a global punchline with teeth. But in this moment, it was simpler. A patrol vanished. A fleet searched and found nothing. In the space that opened, engineers and case officers saw a window. The ocean had stuttered. They thought they could read it. The ocean's ears, how the US knew where to look. To understand how a sound could become a map, you have to meet the system built to do it. After World War II, Navy engineers and Bell Labs physicists took a simple truth about water, low sounds travel, and turned it into an ear that spanned oceans. They dropped long lines of hydrophones into the deep sound channel, that natural duct where pressure and temperature bend energy for hundreds of miles. They wired those arrays back to shore stations with names that didn't advertise their purpose and trained sailors to turn noise into bearings. On paper, SOSUS looked like electronics. In practice, it was people. In low rooms at places like Centerville Beach and Midway, operators sat over paper gram writers that crawled with ink. What a submarine looked like to them wasn't a silhouette. It was a ladder of narrowband tonals, harmonics off turbines and gearboxes, the steady beat of a propeller blade, rate with her sidebands breathing in and out as load shifted. They learned those ladders like DJs learn tracks. That's a merchant too messy. That's a whale too organic. That's a Soviet boat, disciplined and heavy. When K-129 went missing, SOSUS didn't hear a name. It heard physics failing. A low-frequency impulse hit one array and then, after a calculable delay, hit another. The wavefront geometry gave them a great circle solution, and suddenly the blank Pacific had a box on it that meant something. Analysts pulled out environmentals, see state, shipping schedules, seismic activity, to kill false positives. The spike remained. A watchstander wrote his note twice, because he'd been taught to distrust drama, and even he felt the line didn't belong to weather. Triangulation works because the ocean is both cruel and consistent. The deep sound channels path bends with temperature and salinity, but not whims. Bearings intersect. Time differences become distance. With 3 good stations, you can shrink a target box from hundreds of miles to dozens. Then you decide whether you trust the math enough to move steel. Meanwhile, a different set of ears went looking. USS Halibut, once a missile submarine, and now a platform for things that didn't officially exist, was sent to the coordinates SOSUS Confidence allowed. She towed cameras in a fish that barely cleared seafloor ridges, each pass overlapping the last, building mosaics slow enough to test patience. Back in a lab, technicians pinned 35 frames to cork and traced twisted shadows into shapes. Here was a debris field. There, a hull section, a crater that told them the impact was violent, but not a total pulverization. While that imagery built trust, the shore stations kept listening. They weren't hunting a second implosion. They were building a baseline for what quiet looked like in that water mass across hours and days. If the arrays were lying, it would show up in the drift. They didn't lie. The solution held even as the Soviet search scattered wake signatures across the box. It wasn't victory. It was permission to plan. SOSUS wasn't omniscient. It didn't tell you whether code sat intact in a safe or whether the missile compartment had torn open. It gave you starting coordinates and confidence intervals. But that was enough to pull other systems into the circle. Satellites for patterns of life, airborne acoustics for cross-checks, a second, and then a third run of Halibut's cameras to make sure they weren't chasing ghosts. In a memo later declassified, an analyst put it flat. The arrays indicate a discrete event at time X, location Y, recommend deep reconnaissance. You can almost hear his pencil on the paper. The human moments made the system real. A petty officer at an Atlantic station, hearing the same ocean through a different duct, called a senior chief at midway to ask whether their spike timing made sense. It did. A lab tech in San Diego taped a segment of gram paper to a lightbox and marked transit times with a razor and a ruler because the software didn't exist yet. In Washington, a briefer said the words, implosion signature, to a room where that phrase hadn't been policy before. It became policy that afternoon. There's a temptation to call this a eureka. It was accumulation. SOSUS had been built to hear submarines in motion. In March 1968, it heard one stop. The discipline, cross-station verification, environmental subtraction, mistrust of the first neat answer, kept the box honest, while emotion pushed planners to hope. That balance mattered more than any single bearing ever would. Across the Pacific, Soviet operators weren't deaf. They watched American collections intensify in places that had looked like empty water for years. An intelligence ship, the Gidrograph, shadowed legitimate mineral surveys without understanding they were rehearsals for a lift. In Cable's home, skepticism eroded. It's not that they believed the US could reach 3 miles down. It's that they realized Americans believed they might, and that belief had a way of becoming machinery. In the end, the ocean's ears didn't give the White House certainty. They gave it a reason not to say no. A box on a map, a stack of gram strips, a mosaic on cork board. Those became the first pages in a file that would pull engineers into meetings they couldn't talk about and teach lawyers a sentence they'd quote for decades. The sea had whispered where to look. Now the hard part began, touching what lay there without admitting you wanted to. The impossible lift, physics says no. The first meeting didn't look like a moonshot. It looked like engineers with pencils and bad news. Depth, 16,500 feet. Pressure, more than 7,000 psi. Estimated mass of the target section, hundreds of tons, depending on what they could grip. The ocean didn't care about intent. It cared about load paths, fatigue, and how steel behaves when it's cold, stressed, and moved by a sea you can't see. They started with the obvious and threw it out. Balloons. Impossible at that depth. Compressibility kills buoyancy. Nets. They shred under uneven loading and snag like fishing line on jagged hulls. Dredging. You drag across the wreck and tear it apart. If you wanted to bring anything up intact, you had to touch it like a surgeon and lift like a crane. That meant a ship with a hole in its belly, a capture vehicle the size of a building, and a string of steel that wouldn't sing itself to pieces. Global Marine had done deep drilling. That experience mattered. Drillers understand catenaries heave and the way a ship moves under load. But no one had ever taken the dynamic beating of waves on the surface and turned it into a steady pull 3 miles down. The phrase they wrote on the board was heave compensation. If the ship rose and fell, the string had to hold position at the seabed by bleeding and feeding lines smoothly, or the grabber would bang the wreck like a bell and break its own arms. It's made them honest. A single vertical lift concentrates force. Spreaders and crossbeams distribute it, but only if the structure below can carry it. They didn't know how K-129 had fractured, which frames were intact, which bulkheads had failed. So they sketched a massive claw, later nicknamed Clementine, with multiple fingers to slide under the hull section and clamp. Each finger needed sensors, hydraulics, and a way to conform to irregular steel without point loading it to failure. Each cylinder had to function after sitting in salt water at crushing pressure. If one finger lost pressure mid-lift, the load would shift to the others in milliseconds. Run the math. Local stress spikes, cascading failure. Corrosion was the quiet killer. The sub had sat for years. Steel in seawater develops rust layers and pits invisible on sonar. Gripping corroded plating is like lifting a wedding cake by the frosting. The capture team built mock-ups with intentionally weakened sections and tested how their pads bit without punching through. Pads needed to be broad, slightly compliant, and backed by structure that wouldn't deform. Every success in the lab came with a caveat. The ocean is not a lab. Thermal gradients produced another hazard. The ship's moon pool sat at ambient surface temperature. The capture vehicle descended into near freezing deep water. Materials shrink, seals harden, viscosities change. A bearing that spins fine topside can seize at depth. Engineers specified alloys and elastomers that wouldn't become glass at 4 degrees C and pressures that would collapse a car frame like a can. Redundancy wasn't a luxury, it was survival. 2 pumps for each circuit, bypasses for valves, and manual overrides reachable by manipulators if electronics went dumb. Above the waterline, the hull itself had to be a machine. The Hughes Glomar Explorer's derrick didn't just lower drill pipe. It deployed a string of interlocking sections, each one transferring load while staying straight under its own weight. Think of it as an inverted skyscraper, hung from the roof, vibrating with every swell. The ship's dynamic positioning had to keep the bow, stern, and moon pool aligned over a point, with currents trying to slide it off. This was before GPS. They used acoustic transponders on the seafloor and a suite of thrusters to crab against the sea. If position drifted during the lift, the string would angle, and the claw would pry instead of lift. Then there were failure modes you only see when you draw every line. Vortex-induced vibrations could set the pipe string humming, adding cyclic stresses that turn margins into myths. Welds, thousands of them, became suspects. One bad heat-affected zone at the wrong place could unzip a joint under peak load. They demanded X-rays, then X-rays of their X-rays, and still knew that steel lies to even the best inspectors. A single out-of-spec batch of bolts becomes a lawsuit at shore. At 16,500 feet, it becomes a memorial. Meanwhile, the ocean introduced noise the equations couldn't flatten. Internal waves, density shifts within the water column, push and pull long strings like grass in a river. A tiny misalignment at the claw becomes inches at the ship. In a dry run, Engineers watched a test string vibrate under conditions that didn't look dramatic and realized their margin on fatigue life wasn't a margin at all. They thickened sections, smoothed edges, and begged weight budgets for forgiveness. Every time the math said maybe, the ocean said prove it, so they prototyped. They built a scale Clementine and crushed it in chambers until seals failed and threads galled. They modeled the lift in tanks and simulated flow over fingers. They installed a massive heave compensator and cycled it until hydraulic oil smelled like hot pennies. Still, one engineer carried a note in his pocket. If the string parts under full load, the rebound could tear the derrick down. He slept badly and came in early. There was a moment in a conference room when someone suggested bite and bury, dig fingers into mud deeper than the target's keel, then close. The room went quiet. If they buried too deep, they'd suction lock. If they closed too shallow, they'd shear plating. The compromise: sled the claw in on guides, settle its weight carefully, then inch fingers under, one at a time, watching pressures and deflections like a heartbeat. Patient engineering masquerading as audacity. Risk never went to zero. The best they could do was shape it. That meant choreographing weather windows, pre-staging spare pipe, training crews to bleed line smooth, and writing procedures that started with, if it groans, stop. People who'd never heard of manganese nodules learned to speak in inches per minute, pounds per square inch, and what if branches. The ship would sail with a story about mining the seafloor. The men aboard would try to trick physics into mercy and the sea into patience. The ocean wouldn't clap. It would keep its own counsel. The billion-dollar lie, Howard Hughes and the cover story. If you're going to build a ship the size of a stadium with a hole in its belly and a derrick like an oil rig, you can't hide it. So you make the story bigger than the truth. The CIA needed a face the world would accept without asking for details. Howard Hughes, reclusive, eccentric, already orbiting classified contracts, fit like a glove. He didn't need to show up. His name did the work. The pitch was simple and audacious. Manganese nodules. Ocean floors carpeted in potato-sized mineral lumps, rich in nickel, copper, cobalt. Treasure you could scoop if only you built a ship with a moon pool and a vertical pipe string. Hughes companies would mine them with a cutting-edge vessel, the Hughes Glomar Explorer. Trade journals ran pieces. Congressional staffers nodded. Competitors peered over the fence and wondered if they were late to a revolution. Meanwhile, Global Marine and Lockheed quietly engineered what the nodules could never justify. A capture system named Clementine and a heave compensator that could soothe a string 3 miles long. Front companies sprouted like mushrooms after rain. Summer Corporation took point. A paper mining outfit, Macrodyne, carried contracts. Shell entities signed leases. Bankers saw balance sheets that looked plausible enough for an oil boom era drunk on offshore tech. The beauty of the lie was that parts were true. Deep sea mining research existed. Oceanographers had mapped nodule fields. The engineering for mining overlapped just enough with the real mission that welders believed their instructions and port officials stamped paperwork without fuss. In Chester, Pennsylvania, Sun Shipbuilding laid steel for a hull with proportions that made foremen sweat. The central well, moon pool to the folks on deck, was sold as a way to bring mining pipe aboard without waves tearing it to shreds. The derrick and traveling block looked like a driller's dream. Inside conference rooms, security officers rehearsed answers. It's proprietary. It's a competitive edge. It's Hughes. You don't argue with a billionaire who likes to be left alone. The cover story didn't just mask. It pulled other players into orbit. Marine insurers wrote policies on a business they didn't fully understand. Journalists toured parts of the ship with guides who pointed at future collector modules and handed out brochures with glossy art. The public saw a frontier. Engineers saw load charts. Case officers saw time bought. There was one problem. Secrets leaked sideways. In 1974, thieves broke into a Hughes office in Los Angeles and stole documents tying the mining project to the agency. That wouldn't have sunk a normal cover, but this ship was too strange to ignore. The FBI and LAPD chased the burglars, and the chase made noise. Reporters started sniffing. The Los Angeles Times ran a story, vague and flawed, but close enough to irritate. The word Glomar hit print. The CIA didn't sue for silence. It dialed lawyers and tightened circles. They asked editors to hold specifics. Some did, others didn't. Then, in March 1975, Jack Anderson went on national radio and said the quiet part out loud. Howard Hughes' ship wasn't mining. It had gone out to fish for a Soviet sub. He promised more. Inside the West Wing, staffers stared at phones. The president wouldn't confirm. The agency couldn't explain. The cover had done its job long enough to lift. Now it had to absorb heat. But go back a step. Before Anderson, before the Borglers, the cover story worked so well it created a market. Academic conferences added panels on polymetallic nodules. Corporations drafted feasibility studies. An irony took root. The lie didn't just hide action. It drove real investment toward the fiction. Hughes' name gave permission. The ship's size made it a fact. Even the Soviets, watching with a jaundiced eye, sent the trawler Gidrograph to loiter near nodule surveys, unsure whether to laugh or worry. Inside the Glomar Explorer, life matched the blur. Crews wore company badges, not government pins. Security was a culture, not a checkpoint. You didn't ask about the moon pool's dimensions, you measured them. Hallway posters showed nodules, engineering binders showed Clementine bays. When the ship sailed, the manifest said mining. The hold carried tools for something else. That's how good covers work. They let most people tell the truth and still lie. The money trail told a similar story. Estimates hovered in the hundreds of millions, ballooning past $1 billion in today's terms. Congress wasn't voting line items labeled "Raise Soviet Submarine." The funds flowed through contracts that looked like technology bets and deep ocean research. Cost overruns were explained the way cost overruns are always explained. Design complexity, schedule compression, supplier delays. The difference was that failure meant more than a bad quarter. If the cover cracked before the lift, Moscow might park a destroyer on the box and call it oceanography. There's a micro moment buried in a memo, a public affairs draft line explaining that Hughes' innovative mining vessel would test novel seabed systems at extreme depths. It's the word novel that gives the game away. They were testing, just not for manganese. The phrase would survive in press kits even after the ship docked with a story it couldn't tell. When Anderson spoke, the White House chose a new tactic, neither confirm nor deny. The Glomar Response wasn't born to be cute. It was born to keep a lid on fallout while the Soviets guessed. But that's later. In this chapter, the cover story does what it was built to do. It hides ambition in plain sight, wraps a claw in a mining tail, and buys 8 days of lift in the middle of nowhere. The lie cost a fortune. It bought time. Building the Glomar Explorer, a factory for secrets. They didn't build a ship. They built a machine that pretended to be a ship. At Sun Shipbuilding in Chester, Pennsylvania, yard whistles blew and weld arcs stitched daylight into plates big enough to make foreman joke that Hughes had ordered a floating warehouse. The drawings said mining. The centerline said something else. A moon pool, a rectangular void running through the hull, wide enough to swallow a house and deep enough to hide intent. Above it rose a derrick with a traveling block and elevators that looked like offshore drilling hardware, except everything was thicker, straighter, cleaner. You could mine nodules with this. You could also, maybe, reach down and take hold of a wreck. Everything about the Explorer pushed proportions. The central, well-demanded transverse strength that fought the hole it carved. Frames wrapped around absence. Bulkheads stepped to keep the well from becoming a fault line. The hull had to be stiff enough to resist hogging and sagging, yet forgiving enough to ride swells without turning load spikes into cracks. Inside, corridors threaded past machinery spaces sized like small buildings. Hydraulic rooms for heave compensation, electrical switchgear for a city block, and pipe racks that looked like sculpture until you realized each elbow had a reason. Security lived in the mundane. Welders got badges that opened only what they needed. Drawings were broken into work packages that didn't add up unless you'd seen all of them. A man fitting a bearing carrier knew its tolerances, not its destiny. A woman designing a hydraulic manifold saw flow charts, not the claw it would feed. The cover allowed the truth to hide in parts. You could answer questions honestly and still be inside a lie. Bay that would cradle Clementine didn't look like a lair. It looked like a staging area with anchors for mining tools, tie-down points for collector modules. and an overhead crane capacity that made visiting engineers whistle. Every pad eye was overbuilt. Every deck plate was thicker than it had to be, unless you assumed vertical loads in the hundreds of tons. The ship's heart, the gimbaled heave compensator, arrived in pieces and was assembled like a ritual. Its pistons rose taller than a man. Its accumulators looked like torpedoes cut for parts. If it worked, the pipe string would float on a cushion even while the bow climbed a swell. If it hiccuped under full load, the string would sign wave and snap. Supply chains split and doubled. Global Marines procurement bought drill pipe by the mile, specified to thread tolerances weirdly tight for longevity. Lockheed's shop in Redwood City turned out captive parts under generic names. A single bolt pattern changed across 3 generations in a month because someone flagged a thread pitch that galled in cold tests. The memo said, "Field Experience recommends revision." Field Experience was a pressure vessel in a warehouse and a clock. Timelines didn't just compress, they crushed. Schedules ran parallel, inspections ran hot. X-ray trucks crawled weld seams, then crawled them again. A young inspector caught a hairline in a load path and didn't go home for 2 days because the fix threatened the sequence. A foreman signed off on a component he didn't understand and wrote, "See me," on the Traveler because he wanted to see who came. A machinist stared at a bearing race that shouldn't exist in a miner and signed anyway, because the spec sheet wore the right logos. Above deck, the derrick rose. It looked like all-field kit until you stared at the traveling block's stroke and the traveling spider's cheeks. The block's oversized sheaves were there to keep wire rope bend radius gentle under crime scene loads. The spider's jaws weren't for pipe with drilling mud inside. They were for a clean string you barbied like glass. The moon pool got its doors, massive steel leaves that could shut the sea out so crews could work over still water. Their seals were over-designed for a frontier nobody in the yard admitted they were crossing. Then came the living spaces, long halls, bunks tight as clipboards, a mess that could feed an all-field crew and a few ghosts. Security added layers disguised as admin. Visitors saw lounges and conference rooms. Select crews saw a catwalk walkway under the well, a place where you could look down into a rectangle of night that would one day glow green with work lights and mist. Pressure testing became a religion. Dock trials grew into sea trials that looked routine to reporters on the pier. Departure, return, boilerplate interviews about systems integration. Out at a quiet anchorage, they cycled the compensator until valve bodies warmed, ran the traveling block up and down until a lubrication schedule wrote itself in oil on the deck, and lowered dummy strings through the moon pool until ship motion turned numbers into trust. A deck plate groaned once, just once, when a load kissed a limit, and the chief engineer called a meeting in a space you'll never see on a tour. He said, "If it groans, stop." It became scripture. There's a micro story from Chester. A foreman opened a crate marked collector shoe, Rev C, and found pads with a finish he'd only seen on aerospace jobs. He ran his hand over the surface, frowned, and taped the crate shut. He signed the form because the schedule was real. He went home and told no one what it felt like to touch a secret. By the time the Explorer slid down the ways in 1973, she wore 2 skins. One reflected back cameras and questions with a story that worked. The other hummed under steel, pumps, pipe, cylinders, waiting for a lift no one could name in public. The yard crew cheered. The ocean waited. The factory for secrets went to sea. Chasing shadows, Soviet eyes and American paranoia. While the Glomar Explorer took shape, the other side wasn't sleeping. The Soviet Navy never found K-129, but they did the next best thing. They watched anyone who might. Intelligence trawlers with innocent names and dirty antennas started loitering near legitimate oceanographic surveys. One ship, the Gidrograph, showed up so often it felt like a neighbor who never waved. On paper, it collected hydrological data. In practice, it took pictures, logged bearings, and radioed anything that smelled like cover. In Moscow, the debate sharpened. Admirals who'd scoffed at American engineering now hedged. If the US was building a ship that large to mine, it might be theater. It might not. Cables to Pacific Fleet warned, assume deception, assign assets. A surveillance plan materialized, shadow any Hughes-linked vessel, seed rumors, push propaganda about imperialist pillage of seabed resources. Even if the Americans failed, making them look foolish was free. Meanwhile, inside the CIA, paranoia grew a spine. Counterintelligence briefings stapled to operations plans. Port calls that looked routine turned into choreography. Crews swapped at odd hours. Supplies labeled to fit the mining fiction. Shore leave shaved down because loose talk doesn't stay loose. Security officers scrubbed manifests until Clementine vanished into a sea of collector modules and test assemblies. In a vault, someone wrote in neat block letters, "Treat all approaches as hostile." Timing became a weapon. The first window to sail was set against both weather and press cycles. Reporters poked after the Lowe's Angels office burglary, but hadn't yet pieced the story together. If the Explorer could reach station, drop the string, and start the lift before news hardened, the ocean might drown the hints in distance. If not, you'd have cameras on the pier asking about nodules while you prayed the sea would play along. Unknown to them, across an ocean, a Soviet desk officer underlined a date on a calendar. He'd seen shipping notices for peculiar cargoes and a naval attaché's snippet on Sun Shipbuilding's rush. He wrote mining with a question mark big enough to be hope. In his next memo, he added Maskirovka probable, because deception is easier to believe than audacity. He wasn't wrong, he just wasn't right enough. At sea, paranoia turned into practice. Acoustic transponders were deployed with motions that minimized the chance of a surface wake pattern a satellite could read. Helicopters launched only when absolutely required. Even then, their flight paths were bent to look like all-field ops. A micro-story. A deckhand, told to stencil mining on a crate, painted the letters twice, then wiped his hands like he'd touched something live. He didn't know why the word felt heavy. He just knew not to ask. American counterintelligence didn't just look outward. It looked home. Background checks tightened. Phone calls that would have slid under the radar in another program got logged. Reporters received calls couched as favors. The story's wrong. Printing it hurts sources you'd rather not burn. Some held, others didn't. The agency learned again that the First Amendment doesn't wear a badge. The Soviets probed in their way. A fishing vessel edged within binocular range of an innocuous survey ship testing seabed hardness. A deck camera on the American ship caught a man on the trawler's wing bridge lifting his own camera like a toast. The image made a briefing slide, and a senior officer tapped it with his pen. "If they're here for nodules," he said, "we're late." No one laughed. Inside the Explorer's radio room, operators listened harder than they spoke. The mining fiction came with public-facing traffic, calls to ports, parts orders, weather requests. Under that layer lived a tight net, bursts when necessary, silence otherwise. The guidance was simple: don't give anyone a pattern to measure. Patterns get you caught. Then Jack Anderson spoke on the air. The word Glomar left his mouth and slid across kitchen tables. In Langley, lawyers leaned into phones and invented a sentence that would live longer than any of them. "We can neither confirm nor deny." On deck, nothing changed. Steel still weighed the same. The ocean didn't care about radio shows. But the Soviet calculus did. By late June 1974, they'd assigned a ship to sit on the site. The trawler wasn't a destroyer. It was a reminder, "We see you seeing us." From the Explorer's bridge, the captain watched a dot hang on the horizon and plotted a course that kept the dot at the same bearing. Distance is a kind of courtesy. Paranoia isn't just fear, it's attention. American counterintelligence planted decoys, box loads labeled for nodular say, going to warehouses with real addresses, schedules filed with the Coast Guard that listed waypoints a day old. Soviet surveillance logged it all and fed it into computers that sorted ships by nonsense. In the noise, the truth moved. There's a human moment that doesn't fit on a chart. A Russian radio operator, scanning frequencies on a night watch, paused on a clean, professional silence where chatter should have been. He logged the absence. 10 days later, he told his girlfriend he was listening for ghosts. She said sometimes ghosts are just people doing their jobs too well. The Explorer would go anyway. The Soviets would circle. The Americans would whisper. What tied them together wasn't ideology. It was the same ocean, indifferent and patient, waiting to see who blinked first. The grab, steel on steel, at 16,500 feet. They lowered Clementine slow enough to make minutes feel like hours. The moon pool boiled green under deck lights, then calmed as the compensator found its rhythm. Below that rectangle, the string went taut and vanished into black. Depth calls came in like a metronome, 1,000, 5, 10, each number a reminder that errors compound when you stack them 3 miles deep. On the bridge, a clock ticked. In the bay, a bosun whispered to no one, "Easy." At 16,000 feet, the world got small. The capture vehicle's lights pushed a white tunnel through particulate, flakes drifting like slow snow. Then shadows coalesced into geometry, frames, plating, a curve that once housed a missile. The wreck didn't look asleep. It looked held down by the sea. The pilot, hands on joysticks, eyes on a bank of monitors, breathed through his mouth and inched forward. He'd practiced this on mock-ups above pressure tanks, but the mock-ups never smelled like brine. Sensors read out ranges and angles that didn't agree. Internal waves rocked the beam just enough to make straight lines lie. The guidance tech called a correction. The pilot ignored it, then took half of it. "Settle," the chief said, not because the machine could hear, but because the men could. He bled a breath and bumped Clementine down until pads kissed mud and held. The wreck loomed. The first finger slid under steel. Every pad had its own mind. Hydraulics pressurized slow, then held while strain gauges woke and plotted load across the spread. If numbers jumped, they stopped. If numbers crept, they eased another inch. Touchpoints mattered. A pad too high on a corroded plate would punch through like a knuckle through tissue. Too low, and it would pry the hull off frames it still trusted. They hunted for ribs by feel and by ghost. A jiggle in a gauge meant structure. A dead calm meant void. There's a micro moment you won't find in a tech manual. A tiny crab, ghost white and foolish at that depth, scuttled across a strut and froze in light that had no business there. The pilot twitched and laughed once, short. Then he eased a finger another inch, and the crab vanished into mud that behaved like memory. When the last finger found purchase, the math took over. Squeeze to seat, pause, read spread, bleed pressure into the pads that were lying to themselves about evenness. Somewhere above, the heave compensator hissed and the ship rose and fell without transposing that motion to the claw. The chief called for line. 1 inch. Hold. 2. Hold. The wreck complained. Not loud, not catastrophe, just a long, low groan that came up the pipe like a throat clearing. On the bridge, the captain put both hands on the console and didn't move them. The first inch off the bottom felt like a mile. Silt puffed into a brown storm and the monitors turned useless. They were blind but for numbers. Load rose to a plateau, sat there, then settled a hair as suction let go. They took another inch. The string bent a degree, then the compensator soothed it straight. Men who'd never believed in luck studied gauges the way believers study prayer books and asked the sea to keep telling the truth. Minutes became choreography. Voice loops trimmed to essential. A heave valve that had pecked during tests hummed like a choir. Temperatures crept. A rookie looked sideways at a veteran and saw him blink slow, then open his eyes wide and reset the world. On a monitor, mud cleared enough to show the gap where the wreck had lived, and the new line it was drawing through water that had no room for arrogance. They lifted feet, then tens of feet. Loads climbed with a staircase pattern, stick and slip encoded in steel. Every plateau was a conversation between rust and pressure. Somewhere inside the hull, something shifted, a locker door, a frame surrendering, and the pads redistributed the way good hands do when a friend stumbles. The math allowed it. Barely. Above, the Soviet trawler held station on the horizon. On its bridge, a petty officer scanned a calm sea and wrote, "Nothing significant," in a log he did not love. Down the hall, a signals man tuned across frequencies that weren't talking and heard a kind of dignity in silence. He would go off watch and smoke on a stern deck where the air smelled like fish, not secrets. The Explorer's crew climbed through midnight and into a morning no one saw. The string grew a foot shorter with each call. When they crossed 1,000 feet up, a kid in the bay let himself grin and got kicked gently by a chief with 2 fingers, eyes back. The old man wasn't being mean. He'd lived close enough to failure to be careful about joy. There's a line you don't meet until you cross it. Up to that point, risk feels like a set of numbers. After it, risk becomes a neighbor. The men in that bay met him and nodded and kept working. Steel on steel in a place built for silence. A claw closing around a secret the ocean had kept. And the mantra, whispered or thought, if it groans, stop. If it doesn't, lift. The snap, when the ocean took half back. Halfway home, something changed. It didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived as a tremor, tiny then not, running up through steel like a thought you don't want. Loads crept, then jumped. A pad strain gauge hiccuped. In the control bay, the chief lifted his head before the numbers caught up and said one word into the loop. Hold. The ship obeyed. Heave compensation hissed into a flatter rhythm. Temperatures steadied a hair. The pilot eased Clementine's grip a fraction to relax a pad that was lying. For a moment, the wreck seemed to settle into itself, a tired body shifting on a stretcher. Then the staircase pattern turned into a sawtooth. One finger squealed, a sound more felt than heard. Somewhere inside the hull section, a frame let go with a dull, unfriendly thud. There's a physics to forgiveness, and they'd budgeted for it. Pads could redistribute, hydraulics could balance. But corrosion doesn't honor budgets. A corroded plate at one pad's contact finally behaved like what it was, lace. Under peak stress, it tore, not a clean failure, a zipper. The rip ran until it found a rib and force rerouted itself across the claw like panic. The compensator did its best. The string flexed. The ship rode the motion. The chief had already said the next word. Down. He got 1 inch. It wasn't enough. The break didn't look like a break. Monitors flared with silt. Gauges went non-linear. Numbers that had felt like friends turned abstract. The sound, when it arrived, came up the pipe like a distant argument that ended badly. A short oscillation, 1-2, and then load fell in a way no one wanted. Most of what Clementine held tore free and dropped. Not clean, not total. A piece in the jaws remained, a forward section torn back like a page ripped mid-paragraph. The rest, heavier and more honest to gravity, slid. Visuals showed nothing but brown. Instruments said mass moving past. On deck, no one spoke. In the trawler's bridge, a Russian signals man looked up from a crossword and frowned at nothing in particular. The ocean doesn't perform for witnesses. Down in the control space, the chief's voice stayed level. Stabilize what we've got. The pilot did his job, easing pressure into the fingers that still had metal beneath them, starving the ones that were grabbing air. Heave compensation bled and fed as the string shivered with the recall of a loss that wasn't negotiable. A rookie opened his mouth and closed it. The veteran next to him rolled his shoulders once, as if a burden had shifted from a place muscles could help to a place they couldn't. The next hour wasn't drama. It was work, incremental and mean. They tuned pads until loads looked survivable. They checked seals that had no reason to care. The chief asked for a depth confirmation. The reply came back in a voice that sounded older than the man using it. Above, the captain didn't move his hands from the console. He didn't need to. The ship knew where it had to be. When the silt cleared, the cameras found absence. Below the claw, a void where frames had been. A torn edge, bright in lights that didn't belong that far down. The piece in the jaws looked wrong now, too small for a plan, too large for a souvenir. A tech said, measure, and the pilot did, because measurements give grief something to do with itself. What remained was still heavy, still secret enough to justify 8 days of lift, still human. They resumed, inch by inch, lifting less than they'd hoped with more care than they'd planned. No one said the word failure. No one said success. They watched for the next groan and promised themselves they'd stop if it came. It didn't. The string shortened. The sea continued its indifference. On the Soviet ship, lunch came in bowls that smelled like cabbage and diesel. A petty officer logged wind and sea state and wrote, again, nothing significant. He would go off watch at 1600, step out onto a deck, and squint at a horizon that meant nothing and everything at once. On the Explorer, the men who'd drawn Clementine on napkins and built her in secrecy sat with the quiet that follows consequence. An engineer stared at a load chart that had been his comfort for a year and saw in it, finally, the line where assumptions end. He'd written corrosion variable on a diagram 100 times and believed it as an abstraction. Now he knew what it sounded like. There's a micro-story they don't print in manuals. A deckhand in greasy coveralls reached into a pocket and found a St. Christopher medal his mother had given him. He wasn't a believer. He rubbed it anyway, not for miracles, but because metal you can touch feels like an argument against the metal you can't. When the claw broke surface, first the strings shine, then the battered geometry the lights betrayed. The deck went quiet the way decks do when awe and calculation arrive together. Cranes swung into choreography. Men had practiced in dry runs that never had the weight of this moment. The bay doors sealed. The moon pool went still. The captured piece settled onto saddles designed for a prize larger than this. A man with a clipboard wrote a time down twice. Somewhere in that torn section lay answers and dead ends, the kind you can measure, the kind you can only bury. The rest of the submarine had gone back to the only logic it trusted. The sea had taken 2/3 and left a fraction. In the balance, the mission shifted categories from what they'd promised themselves to what they could live with. Above the bay, someone muttered, "Count what we have." The ocean didn't clap. It had already decided. What they brought up, secrets, bones, and a new problem. When the bay doors shut and seawater stilled into a dark mirror, the room changed. Men who'd sweated through lift calls put on clean coveralls and nitrile gloves. Security taped off lanes that had names no one said aloud. The battered section in Clementine's jaws settled onto saddles with a sigh like a building exhaling after an earthquake. Then the work began, quiet, methodical, and watched by eyes that knew the difference between scrap and signal. They weren't looking for a trophy. They were looking for patterns. Hull plating, when you know how to read it, speaks impact vectors, buckling modes, where a blast pushed and where a frame failed alone. Metallurgists took cores and labeled them without flourish. Heat-affected zone, corrosion profile, grain flow. A man in a white coat scraped samples into vials and wrote the depth on the label twice. Nearby, a technician laid out a piece of conduit and traced its run against a sketch, whispering, "Missile Bay feed," without making it a prophecy. What nobody talked about became the center of the room in a breath. When the first remains came into view, the bay stilled. Bones don't shout. They just insist that the story you're telling isn't only about machines. 6 men, by later count, what the agency has acknowledged, lay where the sea had kept them. Identification, even if you never say the names, is a duty you can feel. Someone found a wallet that had outlasted pressure and time. A photograph stuck to plastic by brine. A face that looked back through a film of salt and years. Everything slowed. A chaplain's words weren't on any manifest. They arrived anyway. Flags no one filmed came out of lockers. Notes were written that no one would ever read aloud. The burial at sea would happen after, outside cameras, and outside the story the cover could carry. In that moment, crews who'd lifted steel because it promised secrets stood a little taller because the room had decided to let the dead matter first. Then the machinery of intelligence work spun back up. Anything that looked like a message, stencil, plate with numbers, a valve stamp, got photographed, measured, bagged. A technician ran a finger along a fragment of cable harness and smiled a private smile. Wire gauge, insulation type, connector pins, each hint a breadcrumb toward how a Soviet yard built power into a boat meant to hide. A pressure hull penetration, cleaned and traced, told stories about tolerances. Even absence mattered. If the code room wasn't here, if the safe had gone with the larger section, that was an answer of its own, the kind that turns a victory into a ledger entry. A micro-story lived on a workbench. A small metal placard, Cyrillic embossed, edges corroded and black, lay under a light. A linguist read it soft and flat. Component designation, date, quality stamp. The quality stamp wasn't where they expected. The historian in the room grunted. "Shipyard pattern," he said. "Severodvinsk versus Komsomolsk." Then shut up because the metal did better than his voice at being useful. The problem arrived with the air. Anything brought up from that depth carries a second payload. Contamination, accusations, politics. If they said nothing, bodies would still be buried far from home. If they said anything, Moscow could twist grief into fury. The calculus got tight. The decision, as it's been described since, was to honor in silence. A ceremony, hushed, precise, unadvertised, on a deck that had seen sweat and secrets. The CIA later released edited film of that burial. Even in those frames, you can feel the weight of words not said. Meanwhile, inside the section, they found no cryptographic safe, no intact radio room. If those had torn away with the larger mass, what remained still mattered. A slice of a missile tube ring, parts of the launch sequence plumbing, the way the Soviets had routed hydraulic redundancies through tight spaces. Each fitting a data point. Each data point a quiet recalibration back in labs that would never claim they'd been blind before. There was a new problem growing in the world outside the bay. Rumors ashore were maturing into stories. Reporters knew the ship's name now. The cover wouldn't hold forever, and the second phase of the operation, Project Matador, the plan to go back for the rest, depended on a silence that wasn't cooperating. Inside the Explorer, the men catalogued what they had and tried not to hear the future knocking. On deck, the captain signed a log that didn't boast. In a cabin, a case officer wrote in pencil, integrity of recovered section partial, remains handled, intelligence value non-trivial. He underlined the last word because the ocean had forced humility on his adjectives. In Langley, the file thickened without a headline. In Moscow, a family in Kamchatka watered a plant and dusted a frame because grief gets smaller jobs when power won't speak its name. There's a reason the ocean keeps its own counsel. It had given up bones and fragments and the kind of secrets that change how you draw a diagram. It had kept faith with its cruelty and taken back enough to make the wind messy. In the bay, under light too bright for morning, the crew finished their inventories, closed cases, and looked at each other without talking. They'd reached 3 miles down, held on, and come away with pieces that mattered and a reminder that the abyss doesn't trade fairly. The leak, Jack Anderson, Glomar, and containing the truth. The first crack didn't sound like a crisis. It sounded like a burglary in Los Angeles, papers missing from a Hughes office, a whisper linking a mining ship to people who didn't show up in trade journals. The FBI chased footprints, local cops asked routine questions, and the noise attracted a different species entirely. Reporters who knew what a strange ship and a stranger cover meant when they shared the same sentence. The Los Angeles Times printed a cautious piece. It got some facts wrong ocean hint, wrong label. But it did what early leaks do. It sketched an outline that other hands would darken. In Langley, calls went out to editors with a familiar appeal. National security lives at risk, please delay. Some did, others sharpened pencils. Inside the Explorer's radio room, nobody turned a single knob differently. The sea didn't care about column inches. Then Jack Anderson spoke to a national audience. March 18, 1975, syndicated radio and television, calm voice, measured cadence. He named the Hughes Glomar Explorer and said it wasn't mining. He said she'd gone out to fish up a Soviet submarine. He promised more. In living rooms, people paused forks over plates. In the West Wing, they stopped pretending the noise would fade. Here's where a sentence got born. A journalist named Harriet Ann Filippi, trained to treat vagueness as a dare, filed a FOIA request not for the operation itself, but for records about the CIA's efforts to stop publication. The agency replied in a way that solved one problem and created a doctrine. We can neither confirm nor deny the existence of the requested records. Lawyers called it a gloved refusal. Reporters called it infuriating. History called it the Glomar Response. It didn't come from clever branding. It came from a corner. Confirm, and you hand Moscow proof. Deny, and you admit there's something to deny. In between sits a sentence that sounds like an evasion but functions like a policy, a public posture that says nothing twice and invites the court to bless the silence. Judges did. Glomarization traveled from one case to another until it stopped needing italics. Back at sea, the Explorer had already lifted what it could and buried what it needed to. Plans for a second mission, Project Matador, were on paper with schedules tied to weather and press cycles that now refused to cooperate. The Soviets, hearing the same broadcasts, didn't need explosives. They needed a hull on the horizon. By late June, they assigned a ship to sit on the site. In Washington, the call came down, cancel the return. The ocean could be patient. Headlines couldn't. Containment became choreography. The White House refused to feed the story, even as it grew teeth. Case officers visited newsrooms with arguments sharpened by consequence. Embarrassment today or escalation tomorrow. Editors weighed civic duty against the sick knowledge that a paragraph can move ships. The Lowe's Angels Times kept printing details. Anderson kept promising more. Seymour Hersh circled. The more the government shrugged, the more the tale hardened into a thing with momentum. There's a human angle inside the doctrine. A foyer officer, mid-career, tired eyes, sat with a draft and crossed out verbs until the reply said as little as possible without sounding like contempt. Across town, a Justice Department lawyer rehearsed the phrase, neither confirm nor deny, in a mirror, not because he loved it, but because he knew the alternative, exposure that would force the Soviets to answer in ways the Navy couldn't intercept. The Glomar Response did more than dodge. It set a tone that would travel well beyond one ship and one lift. Intelligence services on both sides read the same policy lesson. Ambiguity buys room to work. No comment is a door slammed. We can neither confirm nor deny is a door that looks locked but admits the light it wants. In the shadow of that door, other programs learn to breathe. Inside the CIA, the post-mortem avoided adjectives. Successes were non-trivial, failures were partial. The cover had held long enough to lift, then it hadn't. The responsive lie about manganese had sparked real research and real investors. Now it sparked a press war. Memos captured the new baseline, keep Hughes at arm's length, shrink the circle, except that silence is an asset and a liability with the same face. The Soviets filed their own version of closure. They didn't stage a protest fleet, they logged a watch. When it became clear the Americans wouldn't come back for a second grab, the trawler's captain wrote, for the last time, nothing significant. In Moscow, analysts wrote a line that mattered more. If they recovered part, assume they recovered more. Uncertainty is a weapon too. Anderson moved on. FOIA requests multiplied. Glomar became a verb. Years later, declassifications would confirm what the Bay crews already knew. A portion raised, remains honored, intelligence value measured rather than celebrated. But in 1975, what mattered was a sentence that gave the government a way to speak without telling, and a countermove that taught journalists how to push at that silence with law. The people on the Glomar Explorer, long home, watched the story flicker on televisions and said nothing. They de-learned the ocean's grammar. You don't shout at a sea that can take your voice. On land, in courtrooms, in newsrooms, a different grammar took root, phrases that allowed truth to live beside secrecy without killing each other. The word Glomar stopped meaning a ship and started meaning a posture. The operation dissolved into policy. The ocean kept its counsel. The sentence remained. Soviet fallout, doctrine, deterrence, and paranoia. Inside the Soviet Navy's briefing rooms, the tone shifted from scoffing to inventory. The first question wasn't pride, it was math. What did the Americans get? Not did they, but how much? Admiral Staff drew a box around what they couldn't know and wrote a note that felt like policy. Assume the worst. If the US raised a portion, then plan as if code gear, metallurgy samples, missile plumbing, and construction tolerances were examined. Uncertainty did the rest, chewing through assumptions with quiet teeth. Doctrine followed the doubt. Briefers wrote Bastion on chalkboards and underlined it twice. Instead of sending ballistic missile submarines wandering into blue water where SOSUS heard like a cathedral, park them under layered defenses, north of the Kola, under ice, inside air cover and surface screens. Quieting was no longer a modernization path, it was survival. Yard orders hardened, shaft mounts rafted better, pumps isolated deeper, propeller templates tightened, blade edges trailed like forgiveness. Crews saw it as work. Admirals called it deterrence with fewer seams. In closed sessions, crypto officers talked sideways. If codebooks or settings might have been exposed, then change rotation faster, change handling harder. Seal safes, drill burns, audit custody like your life depends on ink. The word K129 never appeared in those memos. Acceleration of replacement did. Communications circuits that had spoken casually about exercises began to whisper. A traffic analyst in a Moscow basement flipped through before and after strings and marked the shift with a pencil he didn't chew anymore. Paranoia didn't shout. It rearranged furniture. Intelligence sections red-tagged mining watches. Any American ship claiming research in deep water earned a shadow. A captain in the Pacific Fleet wrote an order that reeked of memory. If a large foreign vessel holds station over a suspicious grid, assume salvage. Assign a trawler. If a trawler can't move them, assign a problem. The Gidrograph's logs grew thicker. Its crew learned to recognize the shape of silence. The human side carried its own ledger. Families who'd been told on exercise saw a uniform at the door and understood. State funerals happen when there is a body. This wasn't that. In towns on Kamchatka, a generation learned the grammar of loss without ceremonies. That ache traveled upward as caution. Admirals who'd come to power on bluntness began to sound like engineers. You could hear K-129's absence in the way they measured words about risk. Meanwhile, something else was happening in yards and design bureaus. The lesson of the salvage didn't rewrite the steel. It rewrote urgency. If your adversary could send a claw to 3 miles down, then your next generation couldn't rely on arrogance. Leak paths that had felt theoretical became red arrows on drawings. Make it harder for them to learn us, a chief designer told a room and saw heads nod. The strategic layer absorbed the bruise without admitting it. Deterrence is a confidence game with real math underneath. The math said the US might have gotten a slice of your launch plumbing and your acoustic skeleton. The confidence, in Politburo rooms where leaders worried about wheat and missiles in the same hour, had to look intact. The compromise was ritual. Escalate security, accelerate quieting, don't publicize. The best admission is no admission at all. There's a micro moment tucked into a KGB assessment. A case officer wrote that American cover had been plausible but excessive. Hughes, mining, glossy brochures, yet concealed a punch they discounted. He underlined excessive, the way an analyst underlines a regret. The recommendation at the bottom was Maskarovka their own. Build stories to make their sensors chase noise. If they can lift, make them doubt where to reach. On the line, skippers felt the shift. New patrol zones, new rules about radiating at depth, new orders to treat any foreign research vessel as a lens. A captain in the Northern Fleet briefed his crew in a voice that sounded like steel. We don't give them second chances to be clever. Where once a boat might have lingered under the GIUK gap, ghosts, now it hugged ice and counted its own tonals the way a monk counts breath. In Washington, years later, people would argue whether Azorian's take justified the cost. In Moscow, the effect was simpler. It shortened tempers around programs that had already been moving. It gave hardliners a chart to point to when budgets got cut. And it taught an old lesson in a new accent. The Americans would build the improbable if you gave them a map and a motive. Don't give them either. The final echo is the quietest. An engineer in Severodvinsk handed a set of tolerances he didn't think possible on his machines, didn't complain. He tried anyway. That try, multiplied across yards, across patrol rooms, across code cabinets, bent the curve of Soviet submarines toward something harder to hear and harder to reach. K-129's grave had forced a promise no one made out loud. Never let the ocean tell your secrets to someone else again. America's quiet ledger, wins, losses, and what wasn't said. Back home, the paper trail didn't read like triumph. It read like a ledger, quiet columns marked gains, gaps, and do not discuss. Intelligence reports came back stamped with adjectives the community uses when it refuses to brag. Non-trivial, significant, inconclusive. Metallurgy samples, component stamps, tube geometry, wiring harness standards. The granular pieces that let analysts redraw Soviet schematics without ever saying they touched the real thing. You can feel the tone shift if you read enough of those pages. It's not a moon landing. It's a recalibration. The wins were specific. Naval architects updated acoustic models after measuring ring stiffness and penetration fittings the Soviets favored. War planners shaved unknowns off launch sequence timing, not because they found a code room, but because plumbing tells you how a system breathes. Signals folk adjusted their priors on what quieting meant on older classes after seeing how pumps were mounted. A counterforce plan doesn't leap forward on a headline. It creeps on tolerances. Then there were the losses, or at least the absence shaped like one. The torn away section, the part everyone wanted most, stayed where the ocean kept it. Cryptologic teams read the absence as a warning, assume compromise anyway. Rotation schedules tightened. Handling protocols hardened. The irony of a partial lift is that it forces both sides to behave as if the worst happened. That's how deterrence works when evidence is messy. It lives in the space between your certainty and your opponent's doubt. Inside the engineering shops, the effort wrote a second book, How to Build at the Edge of Physics When Failure is Not a Bad Quarter, but a Funeral. Heave compensation went from art to doctrine. Dynamic positioning grew a backbone years before GPS made it fashion. The offshore world would borrow the tricks without ever needing to know where they were invented. A young engineer taped a torn load chart above his desk and started insisting on X-rays for welds no one used to bother with. That insistence would show up later, quietly, in rigs that didn't drop strings and ships that didn't snap under weather some foreman would have called unlucky. The lawyers laminated the Glomar Response. We can neither confirm nor deny left policy papers and migrated to briefings, press gaggles, FOIA replies. It became habit, a posture that protected sources today and set fights for tomorrow. Declassification offices learned to live with it. Journalists learned to litigate around it. In a way, Azorian birthed a tone as much as it recovered a hull, a government voice that says less and gets away with it until it doesn't. The cultural scar tissue settled in too. A small circle carried ceremonies they weren't allowed to name. The film of the burial at sea, released years later, trimmed and dignified, captures the restraint the operation forced, honor without confession. Inside Langley, a few desks kept that reel in mind when later plans crossed their blotters. You can hear it in a marginal note on a totally different program. Plan for remains. That line didn't come from a committee. It came from a room like that bay, and men who stood still for a flag in the wrong ocean. Not everything went into a vault. Some of it went into muscle memory. Joint meetings drew new lines between plausible and possible. A manager who'd spent a year being told no by physics started saying no faster to missions engineered on optimism. Another manager, the kind who smiles at constraints, kept the Sharpie circle around maybe and wrote better heave comp in the margin. This is how institutions learn, by fighting themselves in conference rooms until doctrine arrives dressed as common sense. There's a micro story that sits at the center of that ledger. A junior analyst cleared into a compartment he didn't know existed on Friday and back to ordinary on Monday, spent a weekend reading the file from page 1. He copied a single line into a notebook he couldn't keep. Arrays indicate a discrete event at time X, location Y, recommend deep reconnaissance. He stared at the restraint in those words, at the way they carried grief, ambition, and risk without admitting any of it, and decided to write like that for the rest of his career. 10 years later, he would brief a different president on a different ocean and use the same flat voice. It wasn't style, it was inheritance. Losses also lived in what couldn't be done twice. Project Matador died in a leak, and a generation of operators learned that press cycles are operational variables. You could build a claw the ocean respected and still lose to a story told at dinner. Public affairs learned to plan for that reality. So did the men in suits who politic about budgets. A senator toured the Explorer after the program went quiet and walked its corridors like a man trying to believe a ghost. He asked a single technical question like a talisman. The engineer answered politely and then said nothing for the length of the elevator ride. In the end, the ledger didn't close. It rolled into other files, some wet, some dry, and taught a bureaucracy how to live with a feat it couldn't fully claim. The wins paid in inches on graphs and minutes on clocks. The losses taught humility in a language only the ocean speaks. And what wasn't said, the parts kept behind a door labeled "Need to Know," became a kind of national discipline. Hold your secrets, count your dead, and let the sea keep what it demands. Echoes, the Glomar doctrine, modern ops, and deep-sea wars to come. Neither confirm nor deny didn't stay on a memo. It migrated out of Langley hallways into FOIA case law, then into the bloodstream of modern operations. Cyber units borrowed the posture when attribution gets messy. Space commands learn to talk about satellites, maneuvering nominally, while adversaries count thruster burns. The doctrine isn't a sentence, it's a stance. Keep the adversary guessing, feed them fractions, and let ambiguity do work that hardware can't. Underwater, the echoes are louder. The same heave compensation logic that kept a claw calm became standard on deep water rigs, cable-laying ships, and special mission vessels that show up on AIS as research and mean reach. Dynamic positioning plus moon pools plus modular bays, call it the Glomar pattern, now outfits fleets that tap, map, splice, and surveil infrastructure at continental margins. When a fiber link blinks in the North Sea or a pipeline pressure graph stutters, planners see more than maintenance windows. They see a quiet battlefield. States learn to put oceanographic on the hull and pack the hold with mission bays. Russia's Yanta-class ships tow rumors as carefully as they tow arrays. China launches survey vessels that trace cable routes with a patience that looks like science and isn't. Western navies reply with their own white ships and black budgets. You can't patrol every mile of seabed. You can watch the ships that can. The Glomar Response gave cover to present tense. When cables were cut off Egypt in 2013, the official voice smoothed the edges. No finger pointing, no photos, just restoration timelines. When Nord Stream burst into froth in 2022, the first hours sounded like Azorian's courtroom. Evidence held close, language clipped to possibility, intelligence fused with law. The ocean, again, didn't clap. It watched markets flinch and grids reroute. Meanwhile, industry wears two faces. Deep sea mining, the old cover, has real consortia now, serious geologists and prototype collectors with headlines of their own. But the same hull forms, same cranes, same moon pools offer dual use. A collector module can become a manipulator. A survey line can become a queue. Commercial crews learn to live in shadows they didn't pick, and navies learn to sit on contracts they didn't sign. Look harder at the future. Autonomy slides in. AUVs map trench walls with side-scan fidelity that used to take a ship and a week. Gliders loiter, listening for calibration tones that shouldn't exist. Swarms promise coverage you can't jam easily. The new war won't look like fleets on a chart. It will look like outages at noon, diversions at midnight, repair vessels stacked at sea lanes while briefings stay carefully unexcited. The phrase, "we are investigating," becomes a cousin of neither confirm nor deny. The lesson over all of it is the same one the Explorer taught: steel ages, stories don't. Covers survive their operations and move into policy. Tools migrate from miracles to catalogs. What started as a once-only lift became a template. Build big, lie big, act small. Then build smaller, lie less, and say nothing at all. There's a micro moment in a modern ops room. A watch officer sees a seismic blip on a cable segment that should be quiet. He flags it, gets a call back that says maintenance window, and writes the note anyway. 3 weeks later, a partner nation whispers about a tap. He doesn't forward the earlier note with a "told you so." He updates a checklist. Glomar doesn't just live in sentences. It lives in the way professionals refuse to be surprised twice. The deep ocean will stay the quiet high ground. Satellites swing, drones buzz, but the wire that carries money and memory still runs underwater. The ships that can touch it will carry lab coats and lawyers on the same manifest. When something happens, the voice will arrive calm. No confirmation, no denial, only the promise that services are being restored. Behind that voice, men and women will count bolts and inches and decide, again, how much truth the sea will allow. The last, unanswered question: did they steal a submarine or a moment? If success is measured in tonnage, the ocean won. If it's measured in what lived on afterward, the doctrine did. They reached down and brought up metal, yes. But they also raised a way of operating. Build a cover that shapes reality, accept partials, weaponize doubt. The hull they wanted broke. The habits they needed didn't. There's an answer people like because it fits on a plaque. Engineering marvel, intelligence coup. There's another because it fits in a courtroom, precedent set, sentence minted. The hard one sits between. Azorian proved that secrecy isn't only a vault, it's a narrative discipline that survives leaks, headlines, and hearings. It taught both sides that silence can be a strategy, not an absence. So, did the US steal a nuclear submarine, or steal back initiative from a sea and a rival that assumed depth was defense? Maybe the only honest line is the one they wrote in those reports. Non-trivial. Enough to matter, not enough to brag. Enough to bury 6 men with honor and to build a ship that changed how oceans are used. Hold that thought, because the next fights won't hinge on claws. They'll hinge on whether that posture, calm, ambiguous, relentless, still works when the battlefield is a cable trunk, a cloud console, or a dark hull loitering off a wind farm. The question Azorian leaves us is, could we do it again? It's what do we lift now, and what do we let the sea keep? They reached into the abyss, pulled up metal, and surfaced with a method, ambiguous, disciplined, and patient enough to outlast headlines. The ship is scrap. The doctrine still works in cables, clouds, and quiet hulls. That's the residue of Azorian, partials that move policy, silence that buys options, and a sentence courts still respect. If you want the untold operations that shaped how nations lie, listen, and act without applause, this is the room. Subscribe and watch our follow-up on today's deep ocean shadow war, how research, ships trace fiber routes, and why outages don't announce themselves. We're just getting started.